On February 1st, 1328, the French king Charles IV died without a male heir. To resolve the succession crisis, a group of magnates needed to choose the king's successor. The two main candidates were Edward III, King of England, who was the deceased king's nephew, and Philip, Count of Valois, who was the deceased king's first cousin. Ultimately, the magnates chose Philip as France's next king because they excluded succession from the female line, and Edward was the son of the king's sister. Edward was outraged, but began to reconsider his approach only 6 months later when Philip, now known as Philip VI, quickly smashed a rebellion into submission at the Battle of Cassel. About a year later, in June 1329, Edward withdrew his claim. Despite Edward humbling himself, the French king was unconciliatory. He demanded that Edward swear an oath of loyalty to him, and refused to give Edward any contested lands. Edward was flung back into anger, and the prospect of war became likely. However, Edward calmed his anger and once again humbled himself. He swore an oath to the French king. Perhaps this uneasy peace could have been maintained had Robert III of Artois not come to Edward's court. Who was Robert III? What relation did he have to both kings? And how did he break the peace, contributing to the start of the 100 Years' War? Well, this video aims to answer all those questions. Robert III was a grandson of the previous French king's cousin. Though too distantly related to sit the throne himself, he helped push for Philip's claim. Due to his help, Philip made Robert his personal advisor. However, despite being on good terms with the new king, Robert was unsatisfied. There was a wrong he wanted righted. When Robert was only a child, his grandfather died. He wanted his grandfather's land, the county of Artois. But due to his age, his claim was ignored, and the land was given to his aunt Matilda. Philip, aware of this contention, gave Robert the county of Beaumont-le-Roger in the hopes of appeasing him. But, to Robert, no lands could make up for Artois, the land from which his house derived its name. When his aunt died, and her daughter Joanne inherited Artois, Robert immediately questioned succession, and put forth his own claim. Robert's desire for Artois would be his downfall. In 1331, to make his claim stronger, Robert forged the will of his deceased father. To ensure it looked real, he enlisted a renowned French forger, Jeanne de Divion. However, despite Jeanne's skill, the document was condemned as a forgery. Jeanne would be punished brutally. She was burned at the stake. Robert knew that the king would not look at this treachery lightly. Perhaps out of fear of the king, or out of guilt, Robert ignored the king's summons 4 times. Regardless, Robert could not prevent the inevitable. A trial was held without him present. On April 8, 1332, Robert was condemned to exile and all his lands confiscated. Robert, deep down, felt that these harsh punishments were only what was publicly announced. He feared that the king was going to have him arrested and executed. He was right. When Robert complied with his exile and fled France to live in a county of the Holy Roman Empire, Namur, where his cousin John II ruled as a Marquis, King Philip, only 2 years later, pressured the Bishop of Liege to attack the county. Furthermore, around the same time, Philip tracked down Robert's wife and sons and had them imprisoned in Normandy at the Chateau Gaillard. Robert quickly escaped and took refuge with John III, who was his nephew-in-law, and the Duke of Brabant. This John was not as honorable as the previous one. When Philip asked him to turn over Robert, he agreed. But Robert was cunning and caught wind of the plot and had already prepared his escape. He crossed the English Channel and made it to England. Instead of relaxing in his newfound peace, Robert sought out his revenge. He went straight to King Edward's court. He successfully convinced the king to make him a member of his royal court, likely because he willingly leaked secrets of Philip's court, whom Edward had not forgiven for his harshness. Robert, being perhaps the only man who disliked Philip more than Edward, encouraged him not to hide his resentment of Philip and instead go to war with him. Under Robert's influence, Edward began to see his attempts at appeasing Philip in the past as weakness. Robert did not only make Edward ready for war with Philip, but his presence at Edward's court also made Philip outraged. When Edward refused to expel Robert from his court after Philip demanded it, Philip seized the Duchy of Guyenne on May 24, 1337. In October, Edward, no longer willing to accept Philip's disrespect, declared that France was rightfully his. The war that began would last 116 years from 1337 to 1453 and became known as the 100 Years' War. Though the fighting frequently stopped and started during the war's duration, between 2.3 and 3.5 million people died, nearly the same amount as the Korean War. One of the dead was Robert himself. In 1342, while on campaign against France, he was wounded. Before he could recover from his wounds, he contracted dysentery, also known as the bloody flux, a vicious gastrointestinal disease. He could not face both at once and died.